when building out a digital strategy, why is it so important to understand the full scope of your company's current state?
For a couple of reasons. One is because it's nearly impossible to define what future state is going to make sense for your organization unless you first define where you are today and sort of where you're starting from. So in order to get to that future state and understand what the improvements will be and what the prioritization of those improvements are going to be, you really need to use that current state as sort of a launching point or a springboard into that future state. The other reason it's so important is because from a change management perspective, you're not going to be able to manage change effectively if you don't understand what the current state is and how that compares to the future state and where those gaps are. Companies that skip the current state process will oftentimes, it's almost like they're flying blind. They're defining a future state they think makes sense, but they haven't done it in the context of where they are today and leveraging and capturing the strengths of what they have today. There's, for most organizations, if not all, there's usually nuggets of excellence within what they have. And there's certainly opportunities for improvement as well, but you want to make sure you're at the very least preserving the things that you're doing well, and then really honing in more surgically or in a focused way, targeting those areas that you want to improve. So defining that change impact is very important as well.
Absolutely. And could you share an example of what could happen if you overlook that full analysis of your current state before making any sort of technology implementation or change?
Yeah, few things that people don't think about that happen here is, first of all, you don't know where to start oftentimes when you're defining your future state. Like if I were just to ask you, let's look at our third stage processes and let's not worry about what we do today. Let's just talk about our future state. That's almost impossible to do, first of all, without really thinking about, okay, well, here's what we're doing now. Let's figure out how it's going to look in the future. But second of all, if we just have this total clean slate, it's almost overwhelming to people. And so you end up with a lot of meandering and a lot of inefficient. It's a very inefficient way to define your future state. Ironically, it may sound like you're skipping a step and that's going to streamline the process, but actually it makes it more difficult. So that's one dynamic, is you don't know where to start. It doesn't give you any focus or direction. It doesn't take into account the things that are working well within your current state. And it doesn't give your team any grounding. They need to be grounded in where you are today. Even if it's completely broken and you're going to completely overhaul it, at least they're grounded in it right now, and you need to use that as a way to launch into the future state. The other thing that oftentimes happens, and this is probably arguably even more of a problem with digital transformations, is that when you just jump straight to your future state, what you end up finding, oftentimes people do that under the misguided belief that the technology will help them define what the future state's going to be. So let's not worry about our current state. Let's just focus on this new technology we're going to put in, and that's going to tell us what the future state is. We use their best practices, their vanilla processes and workflows. But the problem, and it's becoming more of a problem over time as technology advances, is that the technology is so flexible in most cases and can handle even the simplest, most basic workflows in a multitude of different ways. So if you don't have a clear sense and a clear vision of what it is you want your future state to be, the technology, you're going to get overwhelmed by the technology. Mm-hmm. And then what ends up happening is either you spend way too much time and money trying to decide what you want to be and define what you want to be when you grow up, while the meter's running on the implementation. Or perhaps even worse, you have the consultants that are the experts in the software that just decide for you how you're going to run your business. And that's a recipe for misalignment and failure ultimately. So those are probably the biggest challenges that you run into if you don't define that future state. And then, of course, the other one is that you don't give this is actually a really important one, so I don't want to be too dismissive of it, mm-hmm. because it is really important. And that's the change management piece. If you just jump straight to your future state, now you're going to at some point have to go back and then define what your current state is, so you understand how people are impacted and how you're going to manage those changes and help them navigate that change. If you don't do that, you're not speaking their language, it won't work. And if you're going to have to go back and define the gaps between what the future state is and then define your current state to get that gap, that change impact, you might as well just do it up front. It's a lot more efficient just to start with the current state, then define your future state later on, rather than have to come back and catch, what the potential current state is later on to be able to do that change impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, so when we're moving on to defining that target operating model, when we talk about future state, we kind of drill down into that. And so at what point in creating your digital strategy should you define and clarify your company's target operating model within kind of that future state assessment?
I view that as all one big
Mhm.
bucket of stuff that you do. So I would say at the same time, and when I say at the same time, it's obviously an iterative, longer term process that takes some time. But in general, you're defining what your future state processes are, what your operating model is. So in other words, not just what the workflows are going to look like at a transactional level, because just to back up, when you look at what software vendors want, when you hire a software vendor and or system integrator to implement your software, what they need to know is what they need to know to design the software. They don't really care necessarily about what your operating model is and how your organization's designed. They just need to know enough to be kind of more at the tactical level of defining the workflows and creating the software. But what you care about, or what you should be caring about as an organization, is what is at a higher level, what is that overall operating model, that overarching operating model, which tells me not just what my end-to-end process flows are, rather than just getting down into the nooks and crannies of specific software functionality. We're defining our end-to-end process flow, and that's really what your operating model should be. It should also be kind of, here's how we're organized. Here's who does what. Here's what the roles and responsibilities will look like. And that's going to give us clarity as we sort of redesign our organization and implement some of the organizational change management activities that are so critical. So I view them as somewhat one and the same, but there's really two layers. You've got your operating model, which is your overarching end-to-end processes, your organizational design, how all the systems, how all of the different technologies will tie together, because usually it's not just one technology. Usually you have to touch other systems. So it gives you some clarity from a solution architecture and data, business intelligence and reporting perspective. And then the second layer is the layer that system integrators and vendors typically look at, which is more, I just need to know what switches to flip in this, or what boxes to check in the software to get it to work the way you need it to work. And that's the next level of granularity from there.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like along those same lines, it's establishing your processes so that they can lead the technology, not letting a vendor come in and saying, this technology, now you need to have a new process because this is how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point too. And that's a subtle but important nuance in what most organizations need to succeed, is to let the processes drive the technology, not just depend on the technology to tell you how you're going to run your business. There's always going to be certain functions or cool little features in the software that are going to give you additional lift or things you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. But in general, you run your business the way you need to run it. You're doing the same sorts of things, whether you're running it on a AI, machine learning fueled modern ERP system, or whether you're running it on a pen and paper and Excel spreadsheets. Oftentimes the businesses are trying to do the same thing regardless of what tools they use. The tools just give them better ways of doing that, at the granular workflow level. And sometimes once in a while, it'll give you completely different capabilities. Like, for example, demand forecasting, it gives you better intelligence and data and insights to be able to provide and to create better demand forecasts, which then leads to better production and production forecasts and operational forecasts and things of that nature. So there are ways that the tools will help you do that better, but in general, you're doing the same thing. You need a demand forecast, and you may do it inefficiently right now. The tool will help you do it more efficiently, but in general, your future state processes should be kind of what you want it to be, regardless of what technology you're using.
Certainly, yeah, for the organization. And is your strategy what will get you to your future state? And then what other elements of your business need to play into achieving your target operating model / future state?
Your strategy and goals and objectives as an organization should lead you to your future state. So in other words, the other reason why defining your future state is so important, back to your previous question, is because you want to, maybe we add this to the previous answer or segment, is that you want your future state to ultimately align with your strategy, goals, and objectives. So when you're defining your future state, you want to do that in the context of how is this helping us enable and focus on what we're trying to accomplish strategically. So yes, when you define your strategy, goals, and objectives and your overall strategy as a company, that should ultimately translate into or get cascaded into what your digital strategy is in a way that your digital strategy is going to support and align with that overall corporate strategy. Where companies get into trouble, and it's amazing how many of them do this, is they they have this set of corporate objectives up here, and then they've got a digital strategy down here, and they're going in totally different directions. Unintentionally, of course, but it's because no one's thought about, well, how do we connect the dots between those two? And so I'd say, yes, your strategy should feed into your future state, but also your current state feeds into your future state too, because by defining your future state, or I'm sorry, by defining your current state, you're inevitably going to define all the things that are broken that could or should be improved, but it's also going to give you a little bit more direction and a way to prioritize those potential improvements as you define your future state. So I'd say that probably the biggest inputs would be strategy, goals, and objectives, current state, those both feed into your future state. Certainly your current systems and architecture, that feeds into your future state, because that's going to give you direction or priorities on what you're trying to accomplish with your future state.
It's important to kind of differentiate the digital strategy from the overall enterprise strategy, and how important those are to be connected, but both different things. I think a lot of times we find with our digital transformation community is they're just focusing on digital strategy as opposed to aligning with the overall company strategy. So I think that's one thing that I would just add to this question, if that's possible. And then what steps does a company need to take to accurately dial in their target operating model?
Well, a few things. One is, the qualitative assessment of your current state, which we've talked about. The other one that is we found to be extremely effective is to do something a little bit more quantitative and analytical in your current state, which is the business process mining. So if you use business process mining tools to really either validate or augment the qualitative understanding you get from discussions around your current state, business process mining is a tool that will look at, what's actually happening in your processes, how are workflows actually working, where the breakdown's happening, how many variations are there in all your different processes, where are things getting stuck along the way, where the bottlenecks. So it just gives you more of an analytical and quantitative understanding of what's happening with your current state. So I'd say you start with current state. If you can augment either as a separate step or within your current state assessment, business process mining, that's a great way to handle it. But then also there on the change management side, there's the organizational assessment, understanding beyond business processes, understanding the cultural strengths and weaknesses and misalignments potentially with your overall strategy in the future. So that's another important part of the current state is assessing that organizational change or organizational readiness and cultural piece of it. And then certainly, another step after that is then to look at, what are your key performance indicators as an organization, and, what are your targets versus what you're actually achieving, where you're falling short, and how could this future state potentially help you improve in those areas. So you kind of do all those things there as a prerequisite to defining the current state, which is then the next step. Then you start to look at, okay, let's define our current state based on what's working well, what's not working well. And as consultants, we oftentimes will bring best practices or other practices from other clients that we've seen succeed in certain areas. And that, that outside perspective can oftentimes give you ideas on how to improve those processes in ways that other companies have achieved as well.
So what are the general performance metrics a company should use to measure their current processes and their future processes? Are they the same or different?
Well, sometimes they're the same, but oftentimes they're different in that they may not have the capabilities to report on the metrics that they want to be reporting on. That's usually the case with most of our clients, is they kind of know what they want to be reporting on, but they also have limitations on the availability of data based on technology limitations. So I'd say it's a combination of both. There's some that are just sort of bread and butter, core, key day-to-day or longer term operational metrics that they look at, but then there's others that they wish they had visibility into, or they wish they had easier access to. The bigger issue typically, though, is the bigger thing that companies struggle with isn't so much which metrics, it's more how do we get those metrics. And so, a lot of times they're hiring us because not that they don't know what their metrics should be, they know what they should be, but they just don't know how to get that data more easily. So without a bunch of manual, work being done, or people having to manually go into spreadsheets or manage spreadsheets to track all these different sources of data, they're looking for more real-time and more automated metrics. So I'd say that's probably the bigger thing, but you still do get organizations, obviously, that their metrics evolve, or as you look to the future state, you're identifying strategic imperatives or things that you're starting to focus on more as an organization, which then influences your KPIs as well. So I'd say it's a mix of both.
Sure. And then are there metrics that can be used to measure change?
Starting at I guess I'd say the end result level, you have your KPIs that you were just asking about, and you define, first of all, what are the targets? How are we going to collect that data, and what can we do to automate the collection of that data? So there's sort of the more, the higher level strategic KPIs, that the output you're looking for at the end of the day with your transformation. These are the things that we want our business to do in terms of results. But then underneath that is, sort of how we get there. How do we get those? How do we drive those results? How do we drive improvements, more efficiencies, or more top line revenue growth, higher customer satisfaction, better asset management or utilization, whatever the metrics are? That's not just going to happen because now you have the data and you can report on it. You still have to find a way to drive performance organizationally to get there. And that's where you go a level deeper to more the root cause, or the driver of what's actually going to drive those results. And that is where you get into measuring, organizational acceptance, organizational adoption, organizational culture. We'll usually go in and do these organizational assessments, and we'll quantify where they are as an organization today and where they're trying to go. We'll help define what is it that they need to do to get to where they're trying to go organizationally. And then you can go back and measure those things over time. So as an example, let's just say that one of our organizational assessment findings is that we don't have a collaborative organization. We work in silos. We have fragmented business processes. People aren't talking to one another. The processes don't flow. Maybe because of system limitations, maybe because we've grown so big that now we don't know what the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, or whatever the case may be. But whatever the cause is, that let's just say that is the end result, is we've gotten to this point where we're siloed. We're not collaborating as an organization effectively. And so what we can do then is, first of all, your organizational assessment will sort of start to quantify on a scale, how big of a problem that is. And then what you do is you start to define from there, what should it be on that scale to get us there, and what do we need to do to help people be able to collaborate better. It's not just putting new tools in place. That might be part of it, but it's also expectation setting, the way we measure and manage people, just driving cultural changes in general. There's a lot of, there's an action plan, a change management action plan that comes from that. And then you can go back and measure results over time for that specific leading indicator that ultimately should feed into the bigger picture indicators I talked about before, which is the stuff like increasing revenue or decreasing cost, or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely. And are there any metrics that businesses typically overlook?
Yeah. In a lot of digital transformations, they tend to be focused on either cost reduction or I guess the more intangible technical debt is sort of a buzzword that a lot of analysts are using, that a lot of organizations are latching onto, which is basically our technology is outdated and we have to implement new technology to get with the modern age. That's such a soft, vague goal that it's not really even a metric. And in fact, it's not a metric. And so what ends up happening is a lot of organizations don't take the time to define their metrics, even the ones that are based on efficiency, like I mentioned, efficiency or cost reductions. But even the ones that do get past that, and they ultimately do decide or define their their other KPIs like efficiency gains or cost reductions, they even those will oftentimes overlook the lower hanging fruit, like can we increase our revenue? Can we increase the customer experience or customer satisfaction? Can we increase employee engagement, employee morale? Those are metrics that organizations should be using to sort of fuel or drive their transformation.
What I'm hearing from you is that metrics is sometimes misconstrued to think only quantifiable numbers, when it really should be a holistic analysis of the overall business. We have obviously some KPIs that are truly indicators or numbers that we want to hit, right? Or ranges conversions, those types of things. But there's also a qualitative analysis when it comes to overall culture within our organization, whether that's user adoption of the new system, whether it's behavior within the organization, resistance, those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, and just adding another dimension to that too, is that you have, once you have your KPIs, it's not as simple as just defining your high level KPIs. Like we want to increase revenue by say, 5%. Well, okay, that's great. That's a target we'll set. You line everything around that as far as what we do to drive a 5% increase in revenue per year. But we have to dig deeper. Like, how are we going to do that? How are different parts of the organization going to do that? How are different sales groups going to do that? What's their contribution going to be? And you have to break it down into manageable chunks to where then you can hold people accountable rather than just having this big pipe dream sort of a metric that no one's really accountable for. It's just a metric we put out there to justify the project or to put in our business case because the board made us put a number in the business case. So we have to take those metrics and then cascade it down the organization so we can get more granular with how we hold people accountable, who's responsible, how do we build the reporting competencies or the data analytics to be able to give insights as to whether or not we're actually hitting those metrics. That's, that exercise of taking the top level metric, driving it down to the organization, that then feeds into the technology piece to make sure we've got reporting capabilities, we've got the technology to enable it. We start to look at how we change people's behavior, roles and responsibilities, the culture to fuel those lower level metrics. And ultimately that should all roll up into the big picture 5% revenue increase metric or whatever it is.
Absolutely. And then how can defining your performance metrics for your current state help you dial in on your digital strategy?
Well, because it's hard to argue with numbers. And so if your metrics aren't meeting your internal benchmarks or competitive industry benchmarks, then there's an opportunity there. And so the good news is there's a lot of external sources for benchmarks that you can use to sort of look at, what is the average, even at a high level, what's the average inventory carrying cost for a manufacturing organization, and where are you at? And sort of you can look at how you compare, and if you're way off, that's an opportunity to improve, and that's might be some low hanging fruit for you. Even if you're at an average level, there might be an opportunity for you to be a top performer in that area. So what could you be using technology to do? But it's not just the metrics themselves, though. You also have to view those metrics in the lens or through the lens of what are we trying to accomplish strategically as an organization. Maybe inventory reduction is not a high priority for us, because what's more important to us, as we've defined in our strategic objectives, what's more important is for us to be the best at providing customer service and providing the best customer experience possible, which would suggest that a stock out of, having an inventory shortage is going to be a big problem for us, maybe more so than the average company. So we might be willing to not be a best in class performer on inventory optimization in the name of having enough inventory to make sure we achieve that more important goal of optimizing customer experience. So metrics are really important. It helps you see where the opportunities for improvement are, but you have to look at those metrics through the lens of what your future state strategy goals and objectives are.
Okay, so process improvement. What are the different ways that business leaders can identify the processes that need improvement?
Well, the first, like I said before, is to look at where your known pain points are. And usually through good facilitation, you can gather a lot of that through your own team, because they know they're dealing with the stuff day to day, and they see where the breakdowns are. The other is, like I said, process mining. That would be a tool or an input we can use here to see actual quantitative data of what's actually happening in our current state processes. And then the other would be, or two other things would be, one would be just sort of what other companies are doing. And that's where third stage often adds value to our clients, is by saying, we see other organizations that have done A, B, or C. Is that something that could work here? And you can sort of leverage what's worked for other companies into your operating model or your future state. And then the other thing, I guess the final piece, which I would put as probably the lowest priority, but still an important one, is the technology. How could technology help us do this stuff better? And there's lots of technologies out there that can do, just about anything you're going to need it to do. So it's just a matter of defining what those needs are and then finding the right technology, as we've talked about in other
So if
That's
you
good.
found a process that needs improvement or has opportunity for improvement, where do you start?
Well, oftentimes there's there's two paths you can go down, or it could be hybrid. So the two paths are typically, what can we do today with what we have to make this process better? Oftentimes, like the collaboration example, let's use that as an example. I was talking about collaboration before and the lack thereof.
Mhm.
The teams aren't collaborating. They're acting, independently in silos. How do we get them to operate more collaboratively? Well, some might say, well, just put in new technology and that'll solve the problem. It's not going to, because that's a cultural behavioral thing too. So if we start with a cultural behavioral thing, then give them tools later, that's typically more effective. So a lot of times you can get more low-hanging fruit and get more immediate bang for your buck by just simply doing non-technological investments in your business. So if you take the time to define, well, how could we get people to work closer together? Could we have cross-functional teams that solve certain problems? Could we put together Kaizen events, or could we create a process owners or a process center of excellence, like a business excellence that looks at all of our end-to-end processes and they collaborate on how those processes work better together? That's inherently going to change behavior. Could we change people's compensation and the way we measure and reward them? So there's things like that you can do to just start moving the needle in that direction. And then ultimately, if you follow that up or reinforce that with new technologies, that's even better. It just adds fuel to the fire. But there's really no point in waiting to put in new technology, because A, the technology is going to take a while to get there. B, it's really expensive compared to what I just described. The stuff I described isn't that expensive to do, and you can start to get immediate value from that. And C, that behavioral cultural change and the process changes that you can do now simply just pave the way for the technology to come in and make it even better and sort of reinforce it. So that's the steps we usually go through, is look at the low-hanging fruit, things that we could start changing now, even before we put in new technology. And there's always going to be some things we can't really do anything meaningful with until we have better tools. There's some subset, it's usually a smaller subset, quite frankly, than the other stuff I talked about. And then there's some that's going to be like a hybrid. You might do a little bit of both.
Absolutely. And so is process improvement where your digital strategy begins to take shape? Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, really, it starts to take shape at a very immature level. I would say when you define your overall corporate strategy and objectives, then you define your digital strategy, and then the business process piece. Yes, that's where it really starts to, you start to see how it's going to morph, what it's going to morph into, or what it could morph into.
Absolutely. And so for larger companies, there could be hundreds of processes, thousands, tens of thousands, those types of things that funnel into daily operations. When going through this phase of dialing in on your digital strategy, should you be looking across every single process?
That's a good question. Not necessarily. Partly because you don't need to, and I'll get back to that and why that is in a minute, but also partly because most organizations just don't have the resources or the time to do that. So now the reason they don't need to, actually, if you consider both of those reasons why not to focus on every process, that's just a reason to prioritize your processes and really look at focus more on the key competitive differentiators, the things that make you unique, or the things that make you competitively superior to your customers or to your market, your stakeholders. And then maybe you focus less on the more commodity-based processes. So, for example, two extremes might be, our customer service processes versus our accounts payable processes. Whether or not we pay invoices faster doesn't necessarily give us any sort of material competitive advantage, but the way we service our customers probably does. So we might spend more time on defining those customer service and order entry, sort of those customer facing processes. Might spend a lot of time going deeper into those areas to really refine what we want that to look like. And we might just do more of a flyover view of AP processes, because quite frankly, there's technology out there that can automate a lot of that. We could probably live with whatever the technology can or can't do. Whereas with customer service, though, we really need to be clear about what we want and need out of that technology to give us that competitive lift. So it's just a way to prioritize efforts to navigate having limited resources and time and money, which every organization has, and yeah, it helps you build momentum too and focus on your overall transformation.
Excellent. And can you share a success story where maybe one minor tweak in a process made a huge change within the functionality of the business?
Ooh, yeah, there's probably lots. I have to go deep into my head on that one, which is always a scary place to be. Let me think. If I can give you a good, maybe I can give you more of a, I'm trying to think of like Samsonite. Samsonite, I feel like would be a good one because I remember a lot we did there. Let me get back to you on that. That might be a
Okay.
follow-up. Can we?
That's
Can
okay.
we
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a good ones. I just am drawn up. I want a real specific one. I can think of like I can make one up, but I'd rather have like this company did this and
Yeah.
yeah, let me come back to that.
You might be able to use the case studies too from the website project if that's helpful.
Yeah, that
to
might
learn
talk my
about that.
point too.
Okay, cool. So we're moving on to change impact for process. How will processes impact the people of an organization?
They will affect them in a lot of ways. First of all, and most superficially, they have a new tool they have to use. So when they come to work every day, now they're using a new tool that they have to learn how to use. So the way they log in, what menus they go to, what transactions they complete in the system, that's changing. But that's actually the easiest part, even though that's where most digital transformations focus. Most, if not all, their effort is just how do we help them complete their transactions. The bigger, more concerning ones that most transformations fail to address is just the material fact that their job has changed. So it's not just that I'm doing stuff differently in the system. Now it's, you might have automated stuff I was doing manually in the past. You might have reallocated work, shifted work around to different people as part of a broader future state operating model. Those are more material and threatening changes to my world than just using a new system. Oftentimes it also leads to different expectations of my job, different ways of measuring performance, different performance measures. So it's a pretty widespread and pretty deep impact that these sorts of transformations have. Even in cases where you think you're simply just upgrading technology or just making an incremental change, the change is almost always, if not always, greater than most organizations think. In fact, our research has shown that, our experience with clients has shown that. I honestly can't remember a case where the change wasn't as much, or maybe it was even as expected. It always exceeds what people think.
Absolutely. And how will processes impact the technology of an organization?
Well, they should drive the technologies that you deploy in the first place. They should also drive how you design the technology. And where this isn't really part of your question, but I think it's worth noting, where there's an inherent conflict in all that is there's going to be times where you have a process need or something you want your process to do, but the technology won't do it. And you either need to figure out, do I customize that software, which has its own risks that we can get to separately. I could also put in a third party, a bolt-on application that might address that need, which has its own risks and trade-offs. Or I might just water down my process to say, fine, I'll just accept whatever the software limitations are. That comes to a head quite often throughout these implementations, and you just want to have clarity around where is it acceptable to maybe just accept and water down the business processes, and where is it not? Where might we take more liberty to, or where might we focus more of our effort on ensuring that we find the right technological solution, even if it presents other technological risks, like by customizing software or adding a third-party bolt-on. If it's for a strategic, super important process, like our customer service example, then we're probably more willing to do that. We're more willing to say, you know what, we're okay customizing. We're okay putting in a bolt-on solution there, even though it creates other risks. That's a good risk-reward trade-off for us. If we're in our AP example, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you put in a separate technology, or why would you customize the software to do your accounts payable process differently when most systems can handle that vanilla function fairly well?
Mhm.
So it really depends on the process, but oftentimes the process and the technology come to a head, and you've got to have strong project governance and leadership and vision to be able to navigate those decisions.
Absolutely. And should business leaders expect resistance to improvements? And if so, how can this resistance be addressed?
Yes, they should absolutely expect resistance. And there is important to note there's two kinds of resistance. There's the intentional resistance, which I think that's what most of us think about when they think about resistance, is we think, are our people going to just flat out going to reject this change or reject this initiative? 99.9% of the time, that is not the case. Most of the time, people want the change. They want the organization to get better. They want to have more efficient tools. They can typically understand the vision of where the company's going. You have the occasional naysayer, the person that's just out there to sabotage the project. But quite frankly, that's probably more of a individual behavioral performance issue than it is a problem with the project that you do have to deal with. But it's not, you don't build the whole project around that. The bigger problem that most executives especially don't anticipate, but they should, is that it's the second layer below that. It's when you get below the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, if you will. It's the stuff you can't see. And that is that, yes, I'm on board with the project. I'm on board with this initiative in general, but I start to feel threatened when you start to take away my job, or when you start to automate certain things, or you take away that sense of pride that I have in being able to collect all this data and create this really powerful spreadsheet that manipulates and gives you all this data that you need. You're telling me that's going to go away. And I might be able to see deep down, I kind of see how that could help the business, but that's a threat to me personally. And I'm probably going to lead with what my personal feelings are. And that's going to create unintended resistance to change. And then how you address it's really prescriptive and different depending on what the source of resistance is. If it's, you have to really tackle the problem head on in a very highly tailored way. So if it's a matter of a lack of understanding, I just don't understand why we're going through this change, then you've got a different approach than if it's, I understand why we're doing this, but I don't agree with, or I feel threatened by the fact you're automating 30% of my job duties. If that's the case, the latter is the case, then what I would do is I'd create a change strategy to, first of all, define what that person's future state job is going to look like. What are they going to do with that 30% of their time that is now being automated? A lot of times executives will just say, well, now you can spend more time on more strategic, important things. Well, what is that? What does that mean? And what specifically is my job going to be with that 30%? So if I can paint that vision and show that how that pride that you had in doing that manual stuff, and now you're going to do something more strategic that's very specific. These are the strategic things you're going to be doing. Suddenly I could get excited again and say, oh, that sounds really cool. Now I'm not resisting this. Now I'm excited about this opportunity because it's not this black hole or an unknown that you haven't defined for me. Now you've defined it for me. You've communicated it to me. I've asked my questions. I've done my little freak out moments, and now I can move on and accept it. In the case of just not understanding why we're going through this process or why the process is changing, then that's a different tactic. That's a more of a educational tactic. So it really, there's so many variations in how you attack resistance. I'd say the key thing though is that it needs to be highly tailored, and shotgun one size fits all approaches are highly ineffective in change management initiatives. However, that is the most common tactic that change teams use is one size fits all shotgun approaches. And that's why change management initiatives so often fail.
Gotcha. Why is it important for you to understand that organizational change management needs to meet process?
Yeah, because you can't do one without the other. You have to have an understanding and assessment of how the process is going to work, and then how an individual's role and expectations and performance measures, that those have to align and come together. So it's not one and the same, but they have to align. And that's why doing the assessment has to look at both the operational side of it as well as the organizational side. It's hard to talk about one without talking about the other.
Right. And then I think you kind of covered this already, but how do you perform an organizational assessment for the processes of your organization?
Well, there's the organizational readiness, which is that broader one that we already talked about. That's more the culture, the organizational structure and things like that. On the operational side, that's where you get into the roles and responsibilities, the change impacts, what you want the future state to look like for all these different roles and responsibilities and jobs and steps within the processes. So as part of the review of business processes, you should also be looking at who's doing what. And again, this gets back to that dynamic that I mentioned before. I probably mentioned a couple times already, where system integrator or software vendor comes in and they just need to know how the software needs to be built.
Mhm.
What you need to know is how are you going to build your processes in your organization? And those are two different things that should sync up, but you can't just focus on the first part. You have to also look at the processes end to end, how they're going to look, and also who's going to be responsible for doing what and what the job designs and the organizational design is going to look like. That should be part of that organizational and operational assessment, even though your software vendor doesn't necessarily need to know or understand all that. You do need to do that to make this all tie together and work.
Right. And then when you have your organizational assessment for your processes, or we can even call it like your business process mapping, those roles and responsibilities, what do you do after that?
Yeah, it's really sort of bringing everything full circle. I mean, partly the technology, what technology is going to best help you to get there. What are the specific process improvements that you might start rolling out now in the interim? What are the ones that you're going to defer and wait for new technology? What's the prioritization? What sequence are you going to roll all this out? Mm-hmm. Most organizations, again, have limited time, resources, and other parameters. And then, what are the interim, like, then you start to get into a little more technical stuff that we haven't talked about, like the architecture, data migration, BI, and reporting. You need to have a clear plan for that. So you'll have a sequence of events that need to happen there. Yeah, I think that's, okay. So you sort of like, you just take everything that you've defined in the assessment, and now you put together a roadmap that gets into how you're going to roll all these different work streams out from the people, process, technology, strategy, technology perspective. I already said technology. I said that twice.